Well, major political parties often run what are known as focus groups. We've just seen the Victorian election done and dusted, so they don't matter so much right at the moment, but you can bet your bottom dollar that federal government is running these constantly. And it does look at certain issues. So I want to bring in now the Director of RedBridge Group, Simon Welsh. Simon Welsh, The Voice. There's a lot of data around about The Voice and its support at the moment. What are you picking up?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, it's interesting. So we have been sort of over the last few months sort of dropping The Voice into our focus groups just to get that temperature check. And I'd say there's no sort of shortage of positive sentiment around the idea. So there's certainly a lot of sentiment and will to do something meaningful, do something constructive for the Indigenous community. That there's no shortage of that. Where there is a gap is sort of around the knowledge of what is being proposed and why. So what we're finding is that folks, as I say, goodwill, want to see something done, want to see something constructive, are sort of looking at this and going, well, I don't quite understand what this voice is, how it would work and those sorts of things. So there's a bit of a knowledge gap around that. Now that creates a potential risk for a kind of a, if you don't know, vote no kind of campaign. So it creates a risk for that. The other part, which is really interesting, is something we've seen emerge more recently, even in sort of relatively kind of progressive younger cohorts that we've been doing in the focus groups, has been around this idea of, well, why does it need to be a referendum? Can't government just get on and do something? And why, and this is the interesting bit, is why do we want to put the Indigenous community through the same thing that the gay, lesbian community went through with the marriage equality debate? That kind of hurt and pain of having your identity, your life dissected in this way. Why do we want to do this? Couldn't government just get on and do it? So there's a bit of a knowledge gap around why a referendum is needed. Now, as I say, that the sentiment is kind of there. And when you, what we call treat those groups, when you then say to them something like, well, the reason that a referendum is needed is to sort of political proof it, so it becomes part of the constitution, so that subsequent governments can't come in and tinker with it. You get a kind of aha moment. So people are positively disposed, but that gap creates not only a problem in terms of the referendum, in terms of voting yes for something that maybe I don't quite understand yet, but potentially a political problem, which is, why are you, government, putting the Indigenous community through this if we don't yet understand why it's needed?
Okay, this is really fascinating, Simon, to see where this goes and how the campaigns go, because we are seeing in the polls that there is a big support for the yes vote when it comes to the Indigenous vote. It's about 2/3 v 1/3. But when we get into campaigns and when we focus our attention on these issues, these things can change quite dramatically. So in the groups, are you picking up anything that would say that, people say, yep, we support it, and that's what's reflected in the polls, but when it comes down to their private vote, if they have reservations about it, there could be a really, soft section that could flip back to no?
I think there's a softer section there if that knowledge gap isn't addressed. And a knowledge gap in some ways is far easier to fill than a sort of an attitudinal gap.
Sure, but do you mean by there's knowledge gap that is one thing, but there's also what I think you're talking about is practical solutions. If people can't see that there is going to be a practical difference to the lives of Indigenous people, they might not vote for it?
I think they're still inclined to vote for it. As I say, the hearts are there. Hearts are there. What's needed is to sort of explain the whys and the wherefores of this particular model. That's the risk. The risk is that those negative campaigns could run a campaign around, we've got to do something, and as you say, we've got to do something constructive. This is not the model to deliver it. That's the real risk to the campaign here. And that knowledge gap, if not addressed early, if you don't get in early, if you leave it until a campaign where you've got competing ideas, competing voices, if you don't capture that, build on that sentiment that's there now to fill that knowledge gap ahead of that debate, then you've left that flank open to that kind of argument.
Right. So perhaps the most potent anti-vote campaign here is going to be that knowledge gap one. If you don't know, you're not sure, just vote no.
Vote no. And I think some of the messaging sort of in the last, I think it's only been in the last week or so that we've heard, say, from the Nationals Party, for example, that messaging around why are we doing it? Why do we need a referendum? Why do we need to put the Indigenous community through this? Why doesn't the government just get on and change legislation to make this happen? That also is speaking into this gap around why the referendum is important, why it's important to enshrine these things in the Constitution. So this gap leaves opportunities open for those that want to run a negative campaign against it.
Yeah, politicians do a great job of complicating things, making the waters really murky. But you know what the best thing is? A referendum. It's not up to them. It's up to the Australian people. But fascinating to see where this campaign goes. Simon, great to talk to you as always.
Thanks, Laura.